Hello, this video is about the terms sex and gender. We're going to explore that terminology as it's used in sociology and some of the other social sciences in this video. The purpose of doing so is to make sure that we understand these terms so that we can thereby apply them to the American South and our study of the South in this class. I want to make sure that I can use your time wisely. I don't want to make this video any longer than it needs to be, so let's go ahead and just jump right in. I want to start by actually talking a little bit just about an overview of the topic that we're going to look at. Yes, I said sex and gender, but let's start with the Greeks of all things. If we're going to talk about the ancient Greeks, we might look at Aristotle, we might look at Plato. We have Plato here on the left, we have Aristotle there on the right. They're discussing philosophy. Plato is talking about the idea of the forms. Aristotle is talking about the middle ground. That's why his hand is out there in the middle. Let's put that one on hold just for a second. Let's think about abstract terms as well, like things like democracy and art and literature, things that, you're driving down the road, you're going to work or something like that, you're going down 73, you don't see art walking around in the field. This is not out there eating grass or anything like that. Irrational numbers as well. There's, this rumor that when the ancient Pythagoreans discovered abstract numbers, they actually killed people who discovered them because they were so outraged of irrational numbers. Put that one on hold too. Beowulf is, it's changed over the years. This is English. This is English as it's supposed to be, by the way. This is Old English. So if you want to talk about like, oh, English shouldn't change. Well, there we go. That's what English used to look like. So if English isn't going to change, then it's right there in front of you. This is what we ought to be speaking, which is, actually closer to German at this point, and looking at this than it is to English these days. Now, why am I beginning all of this with sex and gender? Studying Greeks doesn't make you Greek. Right? It doesn't change who you are. It means that you understand the Greeks better. Putting a label on things like irrational, numbers and things like democracy doesn't change anything about you. It just means that we have labels on those things that we can describe those things and understand them. And language in a culture changes over time. It's just a natural part of the process. I bring all of this up because one of the things I've discovered as I start talking about sex and gender, which here we are, is that students can sometimes get these labels confused because they hear other usages out there in the public. I like to address that head on because I think that that's an important part of this topic. Yes, sex and gender are used interchangeably in public all the time in our normal day-to-day discourse. In fact, if you ever talk to me, I'm going to probably use them interchangeably as well. But that doesn't mean that in certain contexts, if we're doing studies in the social sciences, that we can't use them in very clear and distinct ways, right? Language changes depending on context. And studying these things doesn't mean that we're changing who we are, just like with the Greeks. It just means that we're putting those labels onto the world. So let's look at those definitions then. Sex then, in this usage, is biological fact. It is the way in which somebody is born, right? It could be tied to things like genetics, for example, which, by the way, biological fact is a lot more complicated than you would think. And I encourage you, if you've never thought of or heard of this before, go do some research. There are sex-changing animals out there. Yes, absolutely. Clownfish, snakes, things like that. There are people who have manifested, as a woman who yet have the genetic pattern of a man. So this is a far more complicated thing than you would think. And really, I'm not making things up. Go look this up. Gender, then, is distinct from sex because, again, sex is biological fact. This is what you look at. This is, the physical stuff itself. Gender is the prescribed cultural and social manifestations of sex, right? And these are not universal, absolutely not universal. There is a link posted directly inside the course, for example, that shows you that pink is not inherently a feminine color. In fact, we ascribe pink to girls because of a manufacturing process. A long time ago, something like 100 or more years ago, girl clothes were manufactured in pink and boy clothes were manufactured in blue. And then the public came to associate pink and blue with those appropriate sexes. Again, because that's the public cultural manifestation of those things. Pink is not worldwide considered a feminine color. It just happens to be a feminine color in our particular culture. So now we've distinguished between those two. One, biological fact, two, the manifestation and culture. Let's look at them a little bit more. Here's another argument I can make. Am I redefining anything to do with the Garden of Adam and Eve? Let's just hit it head on. No, absolutely not. If I were going to analyze the situation in the Garden of Eden, I would say that there are two distinct sexes. There is a male and a female. I would say that there are possibilities of different genders here, because how does Adam dress? How does Eve dress, right? Does that change over time? When they begin to have children and then their children have children, how do the clothes themselves change over time? That is, again, gender. Now, I also want to say that I am making this very, very simple because this is a culture class, not a sociology class. Each of these terms, again, can be broken down more. So we have things like gender roles. What are the expected roles for men and expected roles for women? We're going to deal with that a little bit in this class. But we also have things like gender identity. Does a particular individual identify with the cultural manifestations and cultural requirements of being a particular sex inside of a particular culture? So, maybe there's a man out there who's a big burly guy who really likes pink martinis, right? That's something that kind of goes against the strain of being a man in a certain culture, right? So his gender identity, he does not identify with the standard way in which gender manifests. Okay, so let's talk about that just a little bit more. Top left, are these guys gay? No, absolutely not. This is a way in which in certain African cultures, friendship manifests. Men hold hands, right? So that's not unheard of. This is unheard of in our culture. We would consider this to be a sign of romantic affection, but that is not the case worldwide. Let's see. On the right here, we have what are a man and a woman dressed in a mini skirt. It just so happens that when a man is wearing this kind of mini skirt, we call it a kilt. And we say that this is indeed a masculine thing that follows from Scottish traditions, right? So again, if we did not have that Scottish tradition, we would call this a mini skirt, but we do have the Scottish tradition. We also have a man in the top right wearing makeup and jewelry, right? This is a practice done in ancient Egypt. And then there are a couple of other instances here as well. I'm going to actually skip past those. If you want those unpacked, I would say, listen to the podcast. The podcast is a much longer version of this particular lecture. I also want to look at Hugh Jackman just for a second. Hugh Jackman is dressed as a man. Here on the left, he's wearing a tuxedo. This is typically ascribed to masculinity in our particular culture. I picked the picture on the right because Wolverine is amazing. And because, Hugh Jackman, nobody's going to be like, oh, you're not a man. Well, I mean, Hugh Jackman, he would beat you up for saying something like that. He, spent a lot of time developing this kind of physique. Now, I'm making a big deal out of Hugh Jackman because maybe you've already guessed it if you know anything at all about Hugh Jackman. There's Hugh Jackman again on the left, right? He's a singer, a dancer, a thespian, all of these things. And, I would say that if you did not know Hugh Jackman and you evaluated him based on this picture here on the left, you might, based on cultural manifestations, again, of things like gender and the expectations for men in our culture, say that he's gay or something like that. We have Will Ferrell out here in the middle. He is a man. That is his sex. He's born as a man. But two, he has manifested as a woman because of the clothing that he's wearing in this particular case. This is clothing associated with the manifestation of females into our particular culture. So this is a sort of gender norm of those types of clothes. Over here on the right, we have Neil Patrick Harris. He is manifesting as a man. He is wearing, again, men's clothes. But if we look at all three of these on the screen, this is the next thing I want to point out. We look at all three of these on the screen. Again, Hugh Jackman, the way he's posed, the way he's dressed here on the far left, it might indicate that he is affecting a gay stance or something like that. Here in the middle, we have Will Ferrell. He is cross-dressing in this particular case. And then here again on the right, we have Neil Patrick Harris. I point all of this out because if we say that sex is biological fact, great. Again, that's the physical manifestation. That's the physical stuff. Gender is, again, the way in which those concepts manifest into a culture. So expectations for gender. I'm a man. I'm not supposed to cry. I'm a man. I'm supposed to dress, kind of in this way. I'm supposed to be able to fix cars, so forth and so on. Women are supposed to be homemakers. They're supposed to dress a certain way, so forth and so on. That's, again, still gender. I've said nothing in those two terms about sexual orientation. Going back to this slide, sexual orientation is a third component that is completely independent of the other two. I want to emphasize that because, again, this is a culture class. It is not a sociology class or a class on human sexuality. And because of that, we are going to stay away from sexual orientation. But I do want to throw that out there because that's an important component as well if you're going to partition these things off. Again, we're not changing anything. If we went back to the Garden of Adam and Eve, man and woman manifest, in the way that they dress, that's gender. And then we have sexual orientation that they both happen to be attracted to the opposite sex. Okay, now I also want to talk a little bit about the ways in which these concepts manifest with particular individuals. So we have here women dressed, cross-dressing as well. We don't tend to bat an eye when we see this. And I would just, now that you understand this terminology, I hope that you can see it's because traditionally men have had more power in a culture than women have. And so when women cross-dress as a man, they tend to step up in power structure, right? They're adopting the gender manifestations, gender norms of men. And so they're acquiring more power. Whereas on the other hand, if we have a man who cross-dresses as a woman, we tend to see that as the man removing a kind of power. This, by the way, is an image of a father whose daughter was bullied at school because she wanted to wear a certain dress. And so you can see he's, kind of a tough-looking guy. He decided to cross-dress and in order to be able to support his daughter, and then he went to school with her. So I want to point this out because that might help to frame it as well. My goal is to get you to understand these terms. It is not to make you change how you use these terms in your day-to-day lives. As I said, in my day-to-day life, I tend to interchange those two terms, sex and gender, because that's, they've been synonyms for a long period of time. But I know that if I'm having a discussion in sociology, that I need to be able to switch and differentiate between all of these things. And that's all I ask you to do as well. I want you to be able to think about, okay, here's the biological fact. Here's how I was born. Here are the expectations and the things that people have asked me to do as far as my gender goes. Let me point out a couple of other things. We've already seen some cross-dressing in some of the fiction in this class. For example, when we read William Faulkner's An Odor of Verbena, inside of that particular story, you had Drusilla who cross-dressed as a man in order to, as I've just pointed out on this slide, acquire more power so that she can go and fight in a war that she herself felt deep in her bones. That's just the kind of person that she was. Also, if we think back to Richard Wright's tale, The Man Who Was Almost a Man, that title now makes more sense. The man, biological fact, who was almost a man, gender fact, right? So he was born as a man, but in this particular case, he did not manifest the appropriate choices that would make him a man in that particular circumstance. So, for example, at the beginning of the story, a lot of people are calling him, by terms that would mean a young man. But by the end of the story, there's this very distinctive use of the word sir, S-U-H, because they have now seen Dave as a man because he's made a dumb choice. He shot a mule. But then at the same time, they expect him to pay that money back for this dead mule. Because he seems willing to be able to pay that back, they see him as taking responsibility for his mistakes, and therefore they are willing to recognize him as a man. Ironically, at the end of the story, even though he has acquired the ability to be seen as a man, he runs away from his problems. He fires a gun in an irresponsible way at a house with people inside of it, and then he goes and hops on a train. But you'll notice at the end, he gets his idea of what men should and shouldn't be because he thinks back to Bill, right? He says something along the lines of, I bet you Bill wouldn't do it, because he's trying to, in his head, process what would a real man do. That's where we tend to get our ideas of what men and women are, by the people around us and the culture around us. This is one of the reasons why we tend to see these things as obvious and normal when in fact, again, they are not. Worldwide, if you explore other cultures, which I think some of you have done, and I hope that some of you have done in the very first journal in the class, if you explore other cultures and their concepts of what constitute men and women, you'll see that they are very, very different. And that is because, again, it is a cultural instantiation. Jumping back to Dave for a quick second, then he's made a stupid choice inside of this culture, and he runs away from that decision, even ironically as he was about to become a man in the sense of gender. That should help. That should give you an overview. Again, if you are familiar with these sociological terms already, you might be grinding your teeth because you're saying, oh, this is really oversimplified. And if these are brand new terms to you, then quite frankly, you're probably going to spend a little bit of time thinking about these. I hope you do. And I hope that you'll process them. Like I said at the very beginning, just studying them and understanding doesn't change you. It doesn't, studying Greeks doesn't make you a Greek. You're studying terms to do with sex, gender, and sexual orientation doesn't change you. It just means you understand the world better. That should help. If you have any questions, of course, always shoot me an email. See you later.